My father had one rule he set above all the rest, and it was this: never cut a log you haven't turned. You roll it over with the cant hook, and you read every face of it before the saw ever touches it. Because a log will show you a clean, straight side and hide a shake or a ring of rot on the face you didn't look at. And if you cut on what you can see instead of on what's actually there, you'll ruin the board and dull the blade and maybe hurt the man standing at the outfeed. So you turn it. You look at all four faces and the two ends, and only then do you decide where the saw goes. 45 years I lived by that rule. I could turn a log one time and tell you where it would split, what it would yield, what was true about it under the bark. People in 3 counties brought me their hardest logs because I could read what other men couldn't. My father taught me the rule before I was tall enough to reach the saw. I remember the cant hook in my hands the first time, too heavy for me. The way he stood behind me with his hands over mine and rolled a big white oak butt over so slow it seemed to turn by its own will, and made me look. Not glance, look. There, he'd say, see that? On the face you couldn't see from the loader. A shake running up the heart you'd never have known was there. He told me a log is like a man, that it shows you the face it wants you to see, and that the whole art of the work, the whole difference between a craftsman and a fool with a saw, is the patience to turn it over and look at the rest before you commit the blade. I have used that cant hook for 50-odd years. It still hangs by the saw. It is the most important thing my father ever put in my hands, and I am ashamed of how long it took me to learn that the rule was never really about wood. I broke that rule exactly once. Not on a log, on a man. The one man in my life I never thought I needed to turn over, because he had been holding up my roof for 30 years. His name is Hollis Greer. He was my foreman, and I would have told you I knew him the way I know my own hands. I would have been wrong. For 30 years I only ever looked at one face of him, and I never once thought to turn him over and read the rest. My name is Emmett Stroud. I am 69 years old, and I have run Stroud Lumber, a hardwood sawmill in the hills of Arkansas, for 45 of those years. My father built it out of nothing after the war, a single saw and a mule, and I grew up in the sawdust of it. And I have spent my whole life turning the trees of these hills into something a man could build a house, or a table, or a church pew out of. I want to tell this slow, the way you'd work up a bad log, because the thing that nearly took my mill was not the men in the suits who wanted it. It was the man I trusted to help me keep it. Let me show you what was built first. Ashby is a poor county. It always has been. There is not much work in these hills, and most of what there is, I made. At its best, the mill ran 40 men, and 40 jobs in a county like this is not a number on a page. It is 40 families that make their truck payment, 40 kitchens with food in them, 40 kids who get shoes before winter. I have employees whose fathers worked for me and whose grandfathers worked for my father. When the timber market crashed in the early 1980s and every other small mill in the region shut its doors, I mortgaged my own house twice and did not pay myself for the better part of 2 years. And I kept every man on, because a man who lays off his neighbors in a county with no other work is not a businessman. He is just the last one to go hungry. But I want to be honest about the mill, because the honest part is what matters later. We did not survive on cheap lumber. Anybody with money can buy a bigger saw and cut framing studs faster and cheaper than I ever could. What kept Stroud Lumber alive for 45 years was the specialty work. We air-dried our stock slow, the old way, 2 and 3 years in the stacks. We quarter-sawed white oak and walnut the way almost nobody does anymore. And the furniture makers and the timber frame builders and a cooperage 2 states over paid a real price for it, because they could not get it anywhere else, and because they trusted my eye to grade it true. And that eye, the grading and the reading of the wood, was a thing I never could hand off. Not because I wouldn't, but because it takes 40 years of standing at the saw to grow it. the high work, the work that paid for the 40 jobs, ran through me. The logs ran through relationships too. The good timber in these hills belongs to small families, 160 acres here, a few hundred there, woodlots that have been in the same hands for generations. They sold their best timber to me on a handshake. The same handshake their fathers gave my father, because they knew I would not high-grade their woods and leave them a ruined lot. That I would mark the trees that ought to come out and leave the ones that ought to grow. That I would pay fair and pay on time. You cannot buy that with money. It took 3 generations to build, and it lived in no contract anywhere. It lived in the men, and the men knew me. I'll give you one, so it's not just words. Old Carl Tyndall owns 160 acres of hardwood his grandfather left him. Some of the finest standing white oak in the county. Every few years, Carl would call me out to walk his woods, and I'd spend a whole day in there with a paint gun, marking the trees that ought to come out, the mature ones, the ones crowding the young growth, and leaving the rest to keep growing for his grandchildren. A big outfit would have offered Carl one fat check to cut it all to the dirt and walk away, and left him a lot of stumps and washed-out hillside. I marked maybe 1 tree in 15, paid him fair for them, and his woods are richer now than when his grandfather had them. That is the difference. That is why, when the day came, men like Carl did not have to think hard about whose side they were on. I never made them choose between their land and their loyalty. The strangers in the suits never understood that there was a thing in those hills their money could not reach, because they had never once put their hands in the dirt of it. Hollis came to me 30 years ago, a hard worker, smart with the machines, good with the crew. He came up through the mill, off-bearer to sawyer to yard boss to foreman. And somewhere in those 30 years, he stopped being an employee and became the man I leaned on. He ran the floor so I could run the books and keep the buyers and read the logs. He was best man at no wedding of mine because I married before I knew him, but I stood up at his second wedding, and I carried his boy on my shoulders at the company picnic. And when his first wife left him, it was my kitchen he sat in. There was a night, maybe 20 years ago, that I think about now more than I'd like. The creek came up in a spring flood faster than anybody had seen, and the water got into the lower yard where the green lumber was stacked and started carrying off a whole year's inventory in the dark. Hollis and I were down there together until past dawn, the two of us, chest deep in cold, muddy water, chaining stacks to the loader and dragging them up the bank by the light of the truck. Neither one of us saying much because there was nothing to say, just 2 men working to save a thing they both loved. We saved most of it. We sat on the tailgate afterward, soaked through and shaking, and he passed me a thermos of coffee, and neither of us had to talk about what we'd have done if we'd lost it. I would have laid down in that flood for Hollis Greer, I believe, for 30 years. He'd have done the same for me. That is the thing about a betrayal from a man like that. It does not just take what he took. It reaches backward and puts a question mark over 20 years of cold water you thought meant something. 15 years back, I made him a partner. 25%. I did not have to. He had not asked. I did it because he had given the best of his life to my family's mill, and I wanted him to own a piece of the thing he held up. And I wanted him secure if anything happened to me. I had a lawyer draw up a proper operating agreement, and I read every line of it, the way my father taught me to read every face of a log. And I signed it, and I shook Hollis's hand, and I thought I had done one of the better things of my life. I just did not understand, that day, that the same paper which protected him would one day be the only thing that protected the mill from him. I will come back to that paper. It is the whole turn of this story. For 15 years it was good, better than good. Then, about 2 years ago, the world came for the hills. A company called Cardiff Timber Partners started buying up land and mills across our part of the state. They were not lumbermen, they were money. Their business was to buy a working mill and its timberland. Cut the standing timber off fast and hard, clear it to the dirt, automate or strip whatever was left of the operation, and flip the cut-over land to whoever wanted it next. They had bought 3 mills in 2 years and closed 2 of them inside a year of buying. They came to me with an offer that had a great many zeros on it, and I told their man, a fellow named Sutton with very clean hands, that the mill was not for sale, and that the families in these hills did not sell their grandfather's timber to be clear-cut by strangers. And I believed that was the end of it. Sutton had come to the mill in a car that cost more than 3 of my employees made in a year, and he'd walked my floor in clean boots, and he'd looked at my slow-drying stacks of oak the way a man looks at money sitting idle. He told me, kindly, the way they're trained to, that the era of the small independent mill was over, that I owed it to my workers to give them the security of a real company, that I was being sentimental, and sentiment was a luxury a man my age couldn't afford. He used that word too, sentimental, the way Hollis would come to use realistic, 2 halves of the same lie. I told him I had carried these men through worse than him, and I walked him back to his expensive car. I thought turning him down was the whole of it. I did not understand that a man like Sutton does not hear no. He just hears, find another door, and starts looking for the lock that's loose. My loose lock had a name, and I'd given him a quarter of my company. It was not the end of it. It was the beginning of the part where they stopped trying to buy the mill from me and started trying to take it through the one part of it that was not mine alone. They went to Hollis. I did not see it. That is the shameful center of this whole thing, and I will not skip past it to make myself look better. I, who could read a stranger's log in a glance, did not read the man closest to me. Looking back, the signs were all there on the faces I never turned to look at. Hollis taking long lunches in town, Hollis arguing, harder than he ever had, that we ought to modernize, ought to take on debt for new equipment, ought to cut faster and stop babying the slow-dried specialty stock. Hollis starting to talk, in front of the crew, about how the old ways were going to put us all out of work, how a man had to be realistic. That word, realistic. I would come to hate that word. What I learned later, when I finally turned the log over, was that Cardiff had made Hollis a private offer. If he helped them take the mill, he would stay on as their operations manager at triple his pay, with a slice of equity in the new venture. And they had given him more than money. They had given him a story he could live with. They told him the mill was dying, that my stubbornness would sink it inside 5 years, that the only way to save the 40 jobs was to sell to people with deep pockets, and that doing it was not betrayal, it was leadership. They handed a loyal man a way to call his disloyalty by a better name, and he took it, because that is the most dangerous gift you can give a decent man who has started to be afraid. The way they made their move was the paper. Our operating agreement, like most, had a clause for what happens when partners cannot agree. A path to dissolve the company and force a sale of its assets. Cardiff's lawyers coached Hollis to use it. He filed a petition to dissolve Stroud Lumber and sell it as a whole, claiming that my management had become erratic and dangerous, that I was running the mill into the ground, that the only fair thing for the partners was to sell the company, mill and timberland together, to a qualified buyer. And there was a qualified buyer standing right there, checkbook open, Cardiff. And he had an incident to hang it on. A month before, on a cold morning, a young man named Levi, 24 years old and 3 weeks on the green chain, had reached across a running saw to clear a jam, against every rule I'd ever drilled into a crew. And the board had kicked, and it had come within a few inches of taking his hand. It missed. He was fine. I shut the line down myself, white as a sheet, and I sat that boy in my office, and I shook for an hour after. The way you do when you have just watched a piece of your own life nearly end somebody else's. It was the boy's mistake, but I am the man whose name is over the door, and I have always believed that every wound on my floor is mine. Hollis took that morning, the worst morning of my year, and he wrote it into his petition as proof the old man had lost his grip and was going to get somebody killed. I want to tell you I read all this, clear-eyed and cold. I didn't. It put me on the ground for a while. Not the scheme, the doubt. Because here was the thing I could not get around in the dark of those nights. What if the boy nearly losing his hand was not bad luck? What if it was me? What if my eye and my judgment had started to go the way an old saw goes dull so slow you don't notice until it's tearing the wood instead of cutting it? Hollis had run that floor for 30 years. If Hollis, of all men, looked at me and saw an old man who was going to get someone killed, then maybe that was the true face, and my own pride was the rot I couldn't see from where I stood. I'm 69. I have buried both my parents and a brother, and more friends than I can count. And I have stood at that saw more hours than I have done anything else on this earth. And for about 2 weeks, I genuinely believed that the kindest thing left for me to do was take Cardiff's money and walk away before my dull judgment cost a young man his hand. I would lie awake in those weeks and hold my own hands up in the dark over the bed and look at them. The way you look at a tool you've started to suspect. They were an old man's hands. The knuckles had gone thick, and there was a tremor in the left one some mornings that hadn't been there a few years back. And I would think about Levi reaching across that blade, and about how I'd been standing not 15 feet away and hadn't stopped him in time. And the doubt would get into the grain of me, the way water rot gets into a log. Quiet, from the inside, where you can't see it until the whole bean gives. A man can talk himself into nearly anything in those hours. I came within a phone call of giving away the only thing my father left me. Not because they beat me, but because I had started to believe the story they were telling about me, which is the only way men like that ever really win. I told my wife, Lou, at the end of one of those weeks, I think they might be right. I think it might be time. And I meant it. What turned me was Lou, and it was the truest thing anybody said in this whole business. She did not tell me I was still sharp. She did not flatter me. She said, Emmett, you have read the rot in 10,000 logs nobody else could read. Go read this one. Stop staring at the one face Hollis turned toward you and turn the whole thing over. So I did. In the morning, I stopped being the scared old man and went back to being a millman. I went and got my hands on the actual thing. I started with the paper. I took our operating agreement, the one I had read line by line 15 years before, the one Hollis had filed his petition under, and I read it again, the way my father taught me to read a log. Slow, every face. And there, on a face Hollis and his clean-handed lawyers had clearly never bothered to turn over, was the thing that changed everything. The dissolution clause did not work the way they thought. It was not a one-way door that forced a sale to whoever waived the most money. I had written it, with my lawyer, to protect the mill from exactly this. The clause gave the majority owner the right, when a partner moved to dissolve, to instead buy that partner out, at fair market value, set by an independent appraisal. Hollis could ask to break up the company. He could not make me sell it. He could only force a number to be put on his own quarter and give me the first right to pay it. And here was the blade of it, the part that was so simple I almost laughed in that cold office. To make their forced sale look like a rescue, Cardiff and Hollis had every reason to argue the mill was worth little, that it was a dying operation, that my stubbornness had run down its value. The 25% of Stroud lumber was not worth much at all. They had been building that case for months, to the crew, to the court, to anyone who'd listen. They had spent half a year arguing the mill was nearly worthless, so they could justify forcing me out of it cheap. They had set the low number themselves. And the same clause that let them ask for an appraisal let me pay it. I did not have that money sitting around. A man who carries 40 families through a market crash does not have a fat account. But I did not need much, because they had argued the number down so far themselves, and I had something Cardiff would never have, no matter how many zeros they carried. I had 30 years of fair handshakes. I went to the timber families, the woodlot owners whose grandfathers sold to my father, and I told them plainly what was happening and what Cardiff meant to do to their woods. And I went to my specialty buyers, the furniture makers and the cooperage that could not get my quarter-sawn oak anywhere else, and I told them the same. I was not asking for charity. I was offering them a stake in keeping the only mill that did right by them. Between the families and the buyers and a local bank run by a man whose church pews I had milled, I had the money lined up inside 2 weeks to buy Hollis out, at the very price he and Cardiff had spent 6 months insisting his share was worth. I'll tell you how that went. Because it is the part that still puts something in my throat. I drove out to Carl Tyndall's place first, expecting to have to explain it all, to make a case. I'd barely got the truck door shut before Carl said, "I heard. Whole county's heard." He took me into his kitchen, and he and 3 of his neighbors were already sitting there, the woodlot men, and they had already decided. They did not want to return, half of them. They wanted to put their own money into keeping the mill that had kept their woods, and they were almost offended I'd thought I needed to ask. The cooperage 2 states over wired a figure within a day of my call. Their master cooper told me there was not another man in the country who could grade them the oak they needed, and they were not about to lose me to a clear cutter. By the time I had what I needed, it had stopped being a loan and started being something more like a county deciding it would not be strip-mined. The men in the suits had a war chest. I had something they could not put a number on, and it turned out to be worth more, but I did not start with the paper. I have learned, in 45 years of telling people hard truths about wood and about loss, that a man's reason does not open until something in his chest opens first. So I did the human part first, and I did it where it had to be done, in front of everyone it belonged to. I called a meeting, not in a courtroom, not in a lawyer's office, not in some glass room in the city. I called it on the mill floor, at the end of the day shift, with the saws shut down and quiet for once. And I asked every man on the crew to stay, and I asked the timber families to come, and word got around, and most of them did. And I asked Hollis to be there, and Sutton from Cardiff with his clean hands, and they came, because they thought I had finally cracked, and they wanted to watch the old man surrender on his own floor. I stood up on the green chain where everybody could see me, and I did not start with the paper or the appraisal or the buyout. I started with the truth. I told the men what Cardiff was. I told them what Cardiff had done to the 2 mills it closed, where the men who'd been promised their jobs were a year later, which was nowhere. I told them what clear-cutting these hills would do to the woodlots their own families owned. And I told them what Hollis had been told and had chosen to believe, that selling out was the only way to save them. And I said it without spitting it, because the cruelest part was that I think a piece of him had truly believed it. Then I did the thing that actually won it, which was that I stopped talking and let the men speak. Because this is what Cardiff's whole offer rested on, though they had never once thought to check it. Their money was for a going concern, a mill that runs. A mill with logs coming in the gate and skilled hands at the saws and buyers paying a premium at the other end. That is what they were paying for. And that is what they assumed they were buying. Because they read the mill the way Hollis read the dissolution clause, from the one face that was turned toward them. So I turned it over in front of them. I asked the timber families, plain, in the open, would they sell their grandfather's timber to Cardiff to be clear-cut? And one by one, those quiet hillmen said no. Not me, said old Carl Tyndall, whose woods my father bought from his father. You, Emmett, or nobody. And I asked my head sawyers, the men whose hands the specialty work lived in, would they run this mill for a company that meant to strip it and let it die? And Lonnie Beck, who has stood at the saw beside me for 28 years, looked at Hollis for a long moment, and then looked at me and said, I run it for you, Emmett. I don't run it for them. I watched Sutton do the arithmetic. I have spent my life watching men's faces while I tell them what a log is really worth. And I know the exact look of a buyer who has just understood that the thing he came to buy does not exist. There was no going concern. Without the families, there were no logs. Without Lonnie and the others, there were no hands. Without me, there was no grade and no buyers. Cardiff had come to buy a living mill, and what stood in front of them on that floor, the moment the men spoke, was a shed full of cold machines. The floor was dead quiet when the men finished. 40 men and a yard full of hill families, and not one of them looking at Sutton. All of them looking at Hollis, who had told them for months that he was the only one with the sense to save them. There is a particular silence a crew makes when it has decided about a man, and Hollis had stood at the head of that crew long enough to know exactly what it meant. I almost felt for him in it. A loud room you can fight. That silence, from men you've worked beside for 30 years, there is no answering. Sutton gathered his folder and made his careful apologies and left, and the deal walked out the door with him, and it was Hollis who watched it go and finally understood that he had been the only thing Cardiff ever actually needed, and that he had just been spent and set down empty. That was the first blow, and it was the one that mattered. But there was the paper still, and I owed Hollis the truth of it to his face. So I told him, in front of the men, that he had not forced a sale, that he never could have, that all his petition had done, under our own agreement, was put a price on his quarter and hand me the first right to pay it. And I told him that the low number he and Cardiff had spent 6 months arguing for, to gut me with, was the number I would now pay to buy him out. That he had spent half a year proving his own share was worth little, and that I had been listening. That was the second blow, and I will tell you, it was enough. I had more in the bag, and I want you to know that I had it, because the choosing not to use it is the only part of this I am actually proud of. My lawyer had told me there was a real case against Hollis, a partner who files a bad faith petition, who feeds a company's confidential value to a competitor, who works to engineer a sale into his own enrichment. That is a breach a court takes seriously. I could have sued him for it, and likely won. I could have bought him out at the gutting low number he set, and taken him for the breach on top of it, and left him with nothing. No stake, no Cardiff job, no standing left in the only trade he knew. I could have made sure that the man who tried to sell my life's work spent the rest of his own life paying for it. I didn't. I bought him out, but not at the gutting number. I paid him fair, a real appraisal, an honest one, more than he tried to take me with, because I was not going to use a man's own cynicism as the knife to gut him, even after he aimed it at me. Use a man's lowball to destroy him, and you have become the kind of man who set the lowball. And I was not going to let Hollis turn me into that on my way out of trusting him. I did not file the breach suit. I did not call the buyers in other counties and burn his name in the trade, though one phone call would have done it. He has a boy I carried on my shoulders. I was not going to make that boy's father a ruined man to feel the satisfaction of it. I just bought him out, fair and clean, and I let him go. He did not rage. That surprised me. Derrick-type men rage. Hollis went quiet, the way wood goes quiet right before it splits. And he stood on that floor he'd run for 30 years in front of the men he'd told himself he was saving, and he had nothing. He said one thing to me, near the end, low, just for the two of us. He said, "I thought I was being smart. Emmett, I thought one of us had to face facts." And I understood, hearing it, that he had never been a greedy man. Exactly. He had been a frightened one who let a clever stranger sell him the idea that surrender was wisdom, that giving up was the grown-up thing, that a man proves he's serious by being the one willing to sell. He had mistaken cowardice for clear eyes, and the men knew it now, and that was a harder sentence than any I could have asked a court for, and I did not need to add to it. He cleaned out his office, and he left the county. Last I heard, he found work down south, running another man's mill, I hope he runs it well. I hope the next time a clever stranger comes to him with a story about facing facts, he remembers the look on Lonnie Beck's face on that floor and turns the log all the way over before he cuts. The mill is still running. We did not modernize the way Cardiff wanted. We are still slow, still careful, still the last ones quarter-sawing oak the old way for people who know the difference. But I did one thing different after all of it, and it is the thing I am proudest of in 45 years. I put a piece of the mill in the hands of the men who actually hold it up. Lonnie and the senior crew own a real share of Stroud lumber now, written into a proper agreement, every line of it read slow, so that the thing my father built and I kept cannot ever again be sold out from under the men who give it their lives by one man who got frightened in the dark. Cardiff wanted to strip it and hand it to nobody. I gave it, a piece at a time, to the people who earned it. Levi, the boy who nearly lost his hand, still works the floor. He is careful now in the way only a man who has felt the wind off a saw blade gets careful. The other week I watched him teach a new kid my father's first rule. Never cut a log you haven't turned. Read every face of it before the saw. The kid nodded the way they all nod, not understanding yet, the way I didn't understand at his age, the way I forgot at 69 and nearly lost everything for it. I keep my father's cant hook by the saw. I still turn logs with it most days, because I am not done, and because a man my age ought to keep his hands on the thing he loves as long as the hands will hold. I broke his rule once, on the one man I never thought I had to read, and it nearly cost me the mill, the men, and the only thing in my life I ever truly built. They thought I was a finished old man who could not read the grain anymore. They were right that I missed one log. They were wrong about which one of us could not see the rot. I turned it over in time, and the mill still stands.